I've been thinking a lot recently about how cynical our culture has become. And I think that you can see our cynicism no more clearly than in the stories which possess our collective imaginations. That is, the shows we binge watch and the movies we go to see. And if you're not as devoted a binge watcher as I am, then I beg your patience with the first part of this sermon. Because I want for you to think about what I observe as a massive sea change in two genres of television in particular in the last 10 years or so: political drama and fantasy. So, remember The West Wing? Do you remember The West Wing? Aaron Sorkin's masterful depiction of a good-hearted and passionate, though still human, presidential administration. Okay, whether or not you cared for President Bartlett's politics, and I don't expect everybody in this room to have liked everything President Bartlett stood for or his administration, okay? But whether or not you cared for his politics, there's no denying that from 1999 to 2006, the most famous television politician was big-hearted and well-intentioned and out to make a positive difference in the lives of the people he served. Say what you want to for Jed Bartlett's politics, but he was all that. But by 2013, we had exchanged The West Wing for House of Cards and Veep. The series finale of Veep, by the way, was last Sunday, so it was much on my mind. These are two depictions of political life that were, I think, the only depictions of political life that we could collectively stomach by that time without cringing. President Underwood, the protagonist of House of Cards, is evil and conniving. Okay, a villain taken right from the pages of Shakespeare's Macbeth. And President Selina Meyer, the protagonist of Veep, is vain and incompetent. Something like a fusion of Cruella de Vil and one of the Three Stooges. Okay? House of Cards and Veep represent the two takes on politics still on offer in our culture today, in 2019. Conspiracy or idiocy. That's the only way we have to collectively imagine political life, at least if our entertainment is any indication. Consider that in the same time frame, in the genre of fantasy, we exchanged The Lord of the Rings, okay? A high dramatization of good's triumph over evil, whose protagonist hails from a set of unlikely but sure-hearted heroes called hobbits. We exchanged that for Game of Thrones. Now, doesn't that say about everything about the turn of the millennium and the change in our culture? Now, I know Frodo, the protagonist of The Lord of the Rings, was anything but perfect. In fact, he always struck me as downright annoying, kind of wimpy and whiny. I didn't like him. He's kind of like the proverbial millennial, which everybody loves to hate, Frodo. Speaking of millennial, by the way. Frodo was anything but perfect, but you never guessed what side he was on. He was always on the right side. He was for good. And he contended with a power, Sauron, who was evil all the way down. Compare the moral mess that is Game of Thrones. Part of what has made the show, like the books by George R.R. Martin, so compelling is its moral realism. I think this is one of the reasons why this fantasy epic has basically captured the minds and the hearts of almost every American. That is, it is forthright in its affirmation that human beings are downright immoral most of the time. No character in Game of Thrones is immune from some sort of mixed motive or moral compromise. Those of you who are familiar with the show, just think about it a second. Jon Snow is big-hearted but self-righteous to the nth degree. I mean, nearly insufferable sometimes when he's talking. Tyrion is devious and conniving and a philanderer, but his heart's in the right place most of the time. Cersei is ruthless in her pursuit of power, but often downright pitiable and sympathetic. Without giving anything away, and yes, the series finale is tonight, I think we can all agree that in the words of one of the show's most unsympathetic characters, if you think this has a happy ending, you have not been paying attention. I belabor all of this because Christianity actually has a great deal to lose from the demise of happy endings from the 90s to the 2000s. Although perhaps it also has a little something to gain from it too. See, Christianity has just as much or more moral realism as Game of Thrones or House of Cards. Ours is the notion of total depravity. Ours, the story of the death of God. Ours, the tragic descent of even our Lord Jesus Christ into the meaningless abyss of hell. Pretty realistic. Pretty tragic. And so far as the turning of our cultural tide toward these more realistic and tragic depictions of human venture, no more Jed Bartlett, only Tyrion Lannister, this might have the effect of confirming something of our collective sense of reality as sinful and broken. And to that extent, Christian belief arguably stands to benefit. Yet the despair and the cynicism bred by believing in this and nothing else, all sin, no grace, as it were, is no good for us. It is poisoning us, regardless of our politics or the shows we watch. As 5 minutes on Twitter will tell you, the emotional life of cynicism is snark. And snark is thin gruel, consumable only by those safe, secure, and healthy enough not to need the sturdier but more earnest meat of hope. And hope is the Christian business. The business of happy endings, of resurrections great and small, the happiest of which we heard proclaimed but a moment ago from the revelation of St. John the Divine, that God will make God's home among mortals and will wipe every tear from our eyes. I need to believe God will wipe away these tears. I need it in my bones, because I just cannot shake the sense that there is something wrong with the world and not merely something wrong with us. To be a Christian is to say that what's wrong with the world has a name, and that name is death. And that one day, in the fullness of time, it will be no more. This is a promise grounded in the truth of our Lord's resurrection from the dead on the third day. Jesus' resurrection is not just a metaphor for the daffodils coming up in the spring, nor even, I think, is it just a symbol of the triumph of love over hate or of good over evil. Thank goodness. Because if that was all the resurrection was, it would be useless to us. The daffodils die. Everyone I've ever seen has died. And they freeze. And after winter, they decompose. And God aside, the triumph of hate over love, to be honest with you, seems just as likely to me as the reverse, given just how fragile our alliances and friendships are, and just how monstrous our genocides and betrayals. And in any case, if that's all Eastertide is, a celebration of springtime and warm fuzzies, then it's Let's be clear, not worth any of us being here this morning. It's actually not even worth my giving up my life to this priesthood. I love you all, but it would be better just to meet you all at Rosie's next week and then to brunch crawl our way through lower Fairfield County together. Easter is about the wild Christian hope that this world has a happy ending, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Despite the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and the some 12.4 million others, Serbs, Slavs, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Romani, people with disabilities, all of whom were exterminated under Nazi population policy in the mid-20th century. Despite the 6 men, women, and children murdered every minute of every hour of every day for 100 days during the Rwandan genocide in the 90s. Despite the over 1,700 rapes reported to the NYPD in the city of New York last year alone. Despite the 5% rise in crime in New York, rise in hate crimes in New York in that same period, and the 22% rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes, and the 33% rise of hate crimes against black people in the same time. Despite the 8 school shootings in this year so far, despite the 610,000 deaths from heart disease in the United States every year, despite the 1.7 million cancer diagnoses, despite the estimated 72,000 deaths from drug overdose in the U.S. in the last year, despite the 16,000 children who die every day according to United Nations estimates, and despite the untold trials I know each of you struggle and contend with every day, not to mention the ones you don't tell me or Reverend Elizabeth or Father Peter about. Christianity is to believe that despite all of that, the world has a happy ending. And it takes a God to bring a happy ending out of all of that. The only reason I believe in a happy ending is because there is a God. And if God is God, then God can fulfill God's promises, including the promise made to us in Jesus that God's eternal home will be among us, that He will dwell with us as our God, that death will be no more, mourning and crying and pain will be no more, and that drawing quite close to us, close enough to see into our eyes, God will see all that we have suffered in this life. And I think God will thank us for it. And wiping all the tears from our eyes, will whisper softly to us, "See, child, I am making all things new." The resurrection isn't just about Jesus. It's about you.